Welcome to the Storycraft portal. Today, we bring you a chilling true crime case that left an entire nation in shock. A brutal murder, a mysterious suspect, and a single clue that changed everything. This is the story of the Idaho Murders, a case that started as a terrifying mystery and became one of the most talked about criminal investigations in recent history. 4 innocent university students were found stabbed to death in their home. For weeks, police had no strong leads, until one witness recalled a haunting detail. The killer had bushy eyebrows. Then came it was the early hours of November 13th, 2022, when a horrific crime unfolded in a quiet college town. 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadal, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally murdered in their off-campus rental home in Moscow, Idaho. The victims, all close friends, had spent the evening partying and enjoying their weekend, unaware that someone was watching them. Surveillance footage showed Kaylee and Madison at a local bar, laughing and carefree. Later, they grabbed food from a food truck before returning home around 1:56 a.m. At the same time, Xana and Ethan, who were dating, had spent the evening at a nearby fraternity house before coming back to the house around 1:45 a.m. By 4 a.m., an intruder had entered the house. 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were asleep on the first floor. But Dylan, sleeping on the second floor, heard noises, whispers, crying, and then the morning of November 13th, 2022, started like any other in Moscow, Idaho. But inside the off-campus house at 1122 King Road, a gruesome scene awaited. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was made from one of the surviving roommates' phones. The dispatcher was told someone was unconscious. When police arrived, they found something far worse. 4 students brutally stabbed to death in their bedrooms. Blood seeped through the floors, staining the walls. Officers described the scene as one of the most horrific crime scenes they had ever encountered. Police quickly realized there was no forced entry. The house had a key code lock, which meant the killer either knew the code or entered through an unlocked sliding door. News of the murder spread. Fear gripped the university. Who could have done this? And why? With no suspect, no murder weapon, and no clear motive, the case was a mystery. But one detail stood out in the investigation: the witness's description of the man with bushy eyebrows. A man who had vanished without a trace. As news of the murders spread, panic gripped Moscow, Idaho. Students left town, locking their doors in fear. Police had no suspect, no murder weapon, and no clear motive. But they had one eerie clue: a masked man with bushy eyebrows seen by a surviving roommate. Investigators worked around the clock, scouring security footage from nearby businesses and homes. That's when they found something chilling. A white Hyundai Elantra was spotted near the crime scene around 3:45 a.m., circling the area before disappearing. Could this be the killer's car? Authorities released a public statement, asking anyone with information about a white Hyundai Elantra, 2011 to 2013 model, to come forward. Shouldn't Tipsborden. One name kept coming up: Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just 10 miles away. Meanwhile, forensic experts combed through the crime scene. On a bed near one of the victims, they found the investigation into the Idaho murders had reached a turning point. Police had a white Hyundai Elantra and a knife sheath found at the crime scene. But the biggest breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered a single male DNA sample on the sheath's button. With no direct matches in the system, investigators took a different approach: genetic genealogy. They uploaded the DNA profile to a public database, comparing it to distant relatives. The results led them to a family line, and then to one man, Bryan Kohberger. Who was he? Kohberger, 28 years old, was a PhD criminology student at Washington State University. He had studied criminal behavior in depth, even posting online surveys asking ex-criminals about their emotions before committing crimes. Detectives dug deeper. Kohberger's phone records showed that he had been near the victim's house at least 12 times before the murders. He wasn't just a random suspect. He had been watching them. Now, police had a name, a car, and DNA evidence. But they needed more before. With Bryan Kohberger now their prime suspect, investigators moved cautiously. They didn't want to tip him off before gathering solid evidence. Surveillance teams started tracking his movements, watching his every step. His white Hyundai Elantra was found parked outside his apartment in Pullman, Washington, just 10 miles from the crime scene. But there was more. Police checked traffic camera footage and discovered that just hours after the murders, Kohberger had driven over 2,400 miles across the country to his parents' home in Pennsylvania. Was he running? As investigators followed him, they noticed something strange. Kohberger was obsessively cleaning his car, even in freezing temperatures. He also threw garbage into his neighbor's trash bins, avoiding his own. Meanwhile, FBI agents went through the family's trash in Pennsylvania. That's when they found their final proof, a DNA match from Kohberger's father, directly linking Bryan's DNA from the knife sheath to his own family. Now, police had everything. On December 30th, 2022, in the early morning hours, a SWAT team surrounded a quiet suburban home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Inside, Bryan Kohberger was asleep in his parents' house, unaware that his time was up at 3 a.m. Officers broke down the door and stormed in. Kohberger was caught completely off guard. "You've got the wrong guy," he reportedly protested as officers pinned him down. But they already had enough proof. His DNA on the knife sheath, security footage of his car, and suspicious behavior after the murders. Inside the house, investigators found more damning evidence. A knife and black gloves, a digital footprint showing searches about the Idaho Murders. A list of police radio frequencies. News of the arrest spread rapidly. The nation was stunned. How could a criminology PhD student be accused of such a brutal crime? But the biggest question remained. Why did he do it? The trial would soon begin, and the world was waiting for answers. Short image prompt for part 6. Age and forensic evidence. More chilling details emerged. Authorities discovered that Kohberger had searched for information about the Idaho murders even before his arrest. His Google history included how to commit a crime and not get caught. Idaho Murders' latest updates. Do criminals return to crime scenes after Bryan Kohberger's arrest? Investigators began piecing together the strongest case possible. As they combed through his digital footprint, surveillance foo, even more disturbing. His phone records showed that he had been near the victim's house at least 12 times before the murders. He had been watching them. Forensic teams examined his white Hyundai Elantra and found small traces of blood and hair fibers inside. DNA testing was underway, but investigators were already convinced this was the killer's getaway car. With mounting evidence, the prosecution was preparing for what would be one of the biggest trials in recent history. But one major question still lingered: what was Kohberger's motive? As prosecutors built their case against Bryan Kohberger, one question haunted everyone. Why did he do it? Kohberger had no known personal connection to the victims. But when investigators analyzed his internet searches, social media activity, and past behavior, they uncovered disturbing patterns. As a PhD criminology student, Kohberger had spent years studying criminal behavior. He even posted online surveys asking ex-criminals how they felt before, during, and after committing crimes. Some experts believed he wanted to experience the perfect crime himself. Police found that Kohberger had followed Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan on social media. He had also sent multiple messages to one of the victims, but she never responded. Was rejection his trigger? Former classmates described Kohberger as socially awkward, but obsessed with appearing intelligent. Some speculated he saw the murders as a game, a way to prove he was smart. By 2024, the highly anticipated trial of Bryan Kohberger was set to begin. The prosecution had built a mountain of evidence: DNA on the knife sheath, security footage of his car near the crime scene, and his disturbing digital trail. Prosecutors argued that Kohberger meticulously planned the murders. choosing his victims carefully. They presented laughing face. NA evidence linking him to the crime scene. Cell phone records show he stalked the victim's house at least 12 times before the murders. Surveillance footage of his Hyundai Elantra circling the area. Kohberger's lawyers claimed he was being framed and that the DNA evidence was contaminated or planted. They argued that there was no clear motive for him to kill the victims. The DNA found was only a partial match. The surviving roommate's description of the bushy eyebrows was too vague. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, waiting for justice. The media frenzy was over. After weeks of intense testimony, the fate of Bryan Kohberger rested in the hands of the jury. The courtroom was silent as the judge asked the foreperson to deliver the verdict. The jury had deliberated for less than 10 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood and read the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Bryan Kohberger, guilty on all counts. A wave of emotion filled the room. The victims' families wept. Justice had finally been served. Kohberger, emotionless, stared straight ahead. He had spent years studying criminals, but now he was the one in handcuffs. The judge handed down the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some had expected the death penalty, but for the families, knowing Kohberger would spend the rest of his life in a cell was enough. By 2025, the case had become one of the most infamous true crime stories in America. Documentaries, books, and podcasts analyzed every detail. But for the families, no media coverage could bring their loved ones back. The house where the murders happened was demolished.